February 3rd, 1945, 06:23 hours, Santo Tomas internment camp, Manila. Captain Maude Davison stood at the third-floor window, watching the eastern sky turn grey, her hand pressed against the concrete wall for balance because standing required conscious effort when you weighed 80 pounds. At 59 years old, she had kept 76 other American military nurses alive for 1,095 days of starvation and Japanese imprisonment. Every single one of them was still breathing. Somewhere beyond the camp walls, American tanks were rolling toward Manila through streets filled with 17,000 Japanese troops making their final stand. Davison listened to distant artillery fire, felt the building shake with each explosion, and thought about the promise she made on May 6, 1942, the day Corregidor fell. She had promised they would all walk out together. Lieutenant Hattie Brantley joined her at the window, skeletal in a tattered army nurse uniform, watching muzzle flashes from Quezon Boulevard, 3 miles north. Brantley had worked night shift in the hospital, treating Filipino civilians dying from typhoid, with supplies that consisted of boiled cloth and prayer. Her hands bore scars from 3 years of washing wounds with contaminated water because the Japanese refused to repair plumbing. She had learned to perform amputations without proper instruments, deliver babies without sterile gloves, treat tropical ulcers with mashed papaya because there was no medicine. She had done all of this while her own body consumed itself, dropping from 125 pounds to 82. The hospital occupied the 3rd floor of the main building, a Spanish colonial structure that before the war housed the University of Santo Tomas. 6,000 Allied prisoners lived here, and the 66 Army nurses plus 11 Navy nurses stationed at Los Baños had become the backbone of medical care for everyone. They had transformed classrooms into wards, fought to save lives with equipment inadequate for 1918, and now in February 1945, they were trapped between 2 armies in what would become the bloodiest urban battle of the Pacific War. "Contact," Brantley said quietly, pointing toward the northern gate. "American armor." Davison saw them, 3 Sherman tanks moving down the access road, their 50 caliber guns traversing, looking for targets. Behind them came half-tracks loaded with soldiers wearing helmets marked with the 1st Cavalry Division insignia. She felt something twist in her chest, something between hope and terror, because liberation meant surviving the next few hours of combat, and they had come too far to die now. December 8th, 1941, 03:30 hours, Sternberg General Hospital, Manila. 3 years earlier, Davison had been chief nurse for the entire Philippine department, responsible for nursing staff across all Army hospitals. When Japanese bombers struck Clark Field just hours after Pearl Harbor, the wounded arrived in waves, men with shrapnel wounds, burns, traumatic amputations. The nurses worked 72 consecutive hours performing triage, assisting surgery, doing whatever was necessary. That was their introduction to war. By Christmas Eve, General MacArthur had declared Manila an open city and ordered withdrawal to Bataan Peninsula. Davison assembled 88 Army nurses in the hospital courtyard, told them they were being sent into a combat zone, that conditions would be difficult, that they needed to maintain discipline regardless of circumstances. She did not tell them they were about to become the first large group of American women sent directly into combat, because she did not know this herself. The convoy reached Bataan on Christmas morning, 1941. Hospital meant bamboo sheds in jungle clearings. Hospital number 1 near Limay held 2,400 patients in space, designed for 1,000. The nurses worked 18-hour shifts in mud, living in tents, treating patients under conditions that violated every health regulation ever written. Japanese aircraft strafed the wards, despite red crosses painted on roofs. Artillery shells landed close enough that nurses felt the concussion. They learned to work during air raids, to ignore bombs, to focus on the patient in front of them. Lieutenant Sally Durrett was in the operating theatre at Hospital Number 1 on February 14, 1942, when a Japanese bomb struck 50 yards away. The explosion shattered windows, knocked over equipment. The surgeon continued operating. The nurses continued assisting. They finished the surgery, moved to the next patient, kept working. By April 1942, the situation was hopeless. American and Filipino forces were surrounded, out of ammunition and food. Disease was rampant. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever. The hospitals were overwhelmed. On April 8th, General Edward King ordered all nurses evacuated to Corregidor. Many refused to abandon their patients. Second Lieutenant Josephine Nesbitt, 47 years old, and Davison's second in command, organized the evacuation but insisted Filipino nurses be included. When told only Americans would go, she reportedly said, "If my Filipino nurses don't go, I'm not going either." The officer relented. The evacuation happened after dark on April 8th, 9th. Nurses boarded boats that ferried them across 3 miles of water to Corregidor, while artillery fire lit up the sky behind them. They left 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers preparing to surrender. Many of these men would die during the Bataan Death March. Corregidor was solid rock, honeycombed with tunnels where the military had stored supplies. The nurses were assigned to hospital laterals inside Malinta Tunnel. No windows, no ventilation. Temperatures reaching 95 degrees with 100% humidity. They worked by electric light when generators functioned, by candlelight when they did not. The air was thick with the smell of blood, infected wounds, and human waste. Worse than conditions was the constant bombardment. Japanese artillery on Bataan fired shells 24 hours a day. The entire island shook. Nurses learned to recognize incoming shells by their whistle, gauge how close they would land, continue working even when explosions rained dust from the tunnel ceiling. Lieutenant Alice Zwicker was changing bandages on May 5, 1942, when a shell hit directly above the tunnel entrance. The explosion knocked her down, left her ears ringing, vision blurred. She stood up, finished changing the bandage, moved to the next patient. Years later, she said, "You could not think about being afraid. If you thought about it, you would freeze." By early May, Corregidor would fall. On May 3rd, Davison was told to select 20 nurses for evacuation by submarine. She chose nurses who were wounded, seriously ill, older, less physically robust. Medical triage, not favoritism. 10 made it to Australia aboard USS Spearfish. The remaining 66 stayed with Davison because there was no more room. On May 6, 1942, Corregidor surrendered. General Wainwright broadcast the order at 12:30 hours. The nurses listened in the tunnel hospital, heard his voice break. Then Japanese soldiers came into the tunnels, and the nurses became prisoners of war, the largest group of American women ever captured by an enemy force in United States military history. July 2, 1942. The Japanese transferred the nurses to Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, a civilian detention facility holding 4,000 Allied civilians. The nurses were assigned to dormitory rooms in the main building, sleeping 30 to 40 women in spaces designed for 8. But Davison insisted on military discipline. She organized work shifts, assigned duties, enforced standards. Every morning, the nurses woke at 600 hours, dressed in whatever uniforms they could maintain, attended roll call, reported for duty. This discipline became their salvation. By maintaining their identity as military nurses, by following orders and schedules, by working as a professional unit, they gave themselves purpose beyond survival. They were not just prisoners. They were nurses doing their job. The camp hospital was perpetually overcrowded, perpetually short of supplies. The nurses treated malnutrition, tropical diseases, injuries from work details. They performed surgery using instruments sterilized by boiling, administered medicine, begged from guards, or purchased on the black market. They delivered babies, set bones, lanced infections, improvised with whatever materials they could find. Second Lieutenant Eleanor Garin discovered talent for improvisation. When the camp ran out of surgical gloves, she made them from salvaged rubber inner tubes. When they needed splints, she used bamboo. When they ran out of bandages, she organized washing and reusing cloth until it fell apart. She became procurement specialist, trading with guards, bartering nursing services for medicine. The real crisis began in 1944, when Japanese forces started losing the war. Food rations dropped from barely adequate to starvation level. In January 1944, prisoners received 1,500 calories daily. By January 1945, this had dropped to 700. The human body requires 2,000 calories to maintain basic functions. At 700 calories, the body consumes itself. Weight loss was catastrophic. The average among internees was 30% of body weight. Davison dropped from 135 pounds to 80. Nesbitt lost even more. Many nurses weighed under 90 pounds by early 1945, their bones visible through skin, hands trembling from malnutrition. Yet they continued working, continued treating patients, even though they were too weak to stand for long periods. They ate whatever they could find: roots from gardens, weeds boiled into soup, slugs and snails cooked over charcoal, banana peels, mango pits, anything containing calories. Lieutenant Madeline Ulam later described eating flowers from ornamental plants because flowers had more nutrition than leaves. But they maintained discipline. Davison insisted on this. Every morning they woke at the same time, dressed in tattered uniforms, attended roll call, reported for duty. Discipline kept them human, prevented them from giving up, made them different from other prisoners who had lost hope. Crucially, Davison made one decision that probably saved all their lives. Every nurse would share any food equally. If one nurse traded for an egg, it was divided among all 77. If someone received a Red Cross package, contents were distributed fairly. No hoarding, no special privileges. Everyone survived together, or no one survived. This was not easy. Hunger makes people desperate. Starving people dream about food constantly, remember every meal they ever ate, plan elaborate menus for after the war. The temptation to hoard was overwhelming, but the nurses shared everything because Davison told them to, and because they trusted this was the only way they would all survive. January 1945. The nurses were close to death. Their bodies were shutting down, losing teeth, hair falling out, edema, beriberi, scurvy, every vitamin deficiency disease. Many could barely walk. Some were too weak to stand. They lay in their dormitory, waiting for liberation or death, no longer having energy to care which came first. Then, on the night of February 2nd, 3rd, the Japanese guards disappeared. The nurses woke on February 3rd and realized the camp was unguarded. Outside the walls, they could hear battle, American artillery, tank engines, small arms fire. The Battle of Manila had begun, and Santo Tomas was in the path of advancing American forces. Davison ordered the nurses to stay in their dormitory. Do not go outside. Do not celebrate. The camp was in a combat zone. They had survived 1,095 days of captivity. They could survive a few more hours. At approximately 1900 hours on February 3rd, 1945, tanks from the 1st Cavalry Division crashed through the camp gates, and everything changed. February 3rd, 1945, 1903 hours, Santo Tomas Internment Camp, Manila. The Sherman tank smashed through the front gate at full speed, its treads tearing up pavement, 50 caliber machine guns swinging left and right. Lieutenant Hattie Brantley saw it first from the 3rd floor window. American armor, real American soldiers. The horsehead insignia of the 1st Cavalry Division painted on every vehicle. Behind the lead tank came 3 more Shermans, then half-tracks loaded with infantry. The soldiers were firing, rifles crackling in controlled bursts, and Brantley realized with a shock that Japanese troops were still in the camp, positioned in buildings across the plaza, and Santo Tomas had just become a battlefield. Captain Maude Davison grabbed Brantley's arm and pulled her away from the window. Get down! Everyone away from windows. Now! Her voice carried the same tone she had used for 3 years when giving orders. Brantley moved through the dormitory, where 76 other nurses stood frozen, staring toward the sounds of combat. On the floor, stay low. The firefight lasted 47 minutes. American cavalry soldiers moved through the camp, clearing buildings, securing the perimeter, evacuating internees from structures still held by Japanese defenders. Tracers streaked between buildings, bright phosphorescent lines in the darkness. Grenades exploded with sharp bangs. Tank cannons fired point-blank into fortified positions, the muzzle blast so loud, nurses pressed hands over their ears. Second Lieutenant Dorothy Still lay on the floor counting seconds between explosions, measuring combat intensity by how close the shooting sounded. We survived 3 years as prisoners, she thought. Please God, do not let us die in the last hour. At 1950 hours, the shooting stopped. Silence fell over Santo Tomas, broken only by idle tank engines and distant artillery from other parts of Manila. Then they heard American voices, loud and confident, shouting orders in English without Japanese accents. Lieutenant Erlyn Black started crying because she realized they were actually free. A young cavalry officer appeared in the doorway, a first lieutenant no older than 23, uniform soaked with sweat, face smeared with cordite. He stared at 77 skeletal women lying on the floor wearing tattered uniforms, and his expression changed from combat alertness to shock. "Jesus Christ," he said quietly. "Are you the nurses? The Angels of Bataan?" Davison stood slowly, using the wall for support. She straightened her uniform, smoothed down fabric hanging loose on her frame, and faced the officer with the bearing of a captain who had commanded troops under fire for 3 years. "Captain Maude Davison, United States Army Nurse Corps. I have 76 nurses under my command, all present, all alive. We require immediate medical evacuation for critical malnutrition cases and transport for 6,000 civilian internees who are our patients. Can you provide that, Lieutenant?" The officer stared for 3 seconds, then snapped to attention and saluted. "Yes, ma'am. We have medics setting up an aid station in the plaza. We'll get you evacuated as soon as the perimeter is secure." "The perimeter is not my concern, Lieutenant. My patients are. There are 400 internees requiring immediate hospitalization. I need you to coordinate evacuation priorities with your commanding officer." Davison's voice was steady, professional. A nurse who had spent 3 years making life-or-death decisions with inadequate resources and was not stopping now just because American tanks had arrived. The lieutenant nodded, saluted again, and left. Davison turned back to her nurses, saw them watching her with expressions mixing relief and exhaustion and something like awe. They had made it, all 77, just as she had promised on May 6, 1942, when this nightmare began. But the nightmare was not over yet. February 4th, 1945, 08:20 hours. The battle for Manila continued. Japanese forces had turned the city into a fortress, occupying concrete buildings, establishing machine gun nests at intersections, preparing to fight to the death. American artillery pounded positions. Naval guns from ships offshore fired salvos. Aircraft dropped bombs on strongpoints. Santo Tomas sat in the middle of this combat zone, and although cavalry had liberated the camp, they could not evacuate internees while fighting raged outside. The nurses worked alongside American medics, treating wounded cavalry soldiers carried into the camp hospital as fighting intensified. Lieutenant Minnie Breese, who had performed countless surgeries during 3 years using improvised instruments, found herself working with actual surgical tools again. Real scalpels with sharp edges, real sutures made from catgut instead of boiled thread, real antibiotics. She stood at an operating table removing shrapnel from a cavalry sergeant's leg, and her hands shook, not from fear, but because malnutrition had stolen fine motor control. The American medics watched the nurses work with a mixture of respect and horror. A young corpsman from Iowa, stood beside Lieutenant Sally Durrett as she inserted an intravenous line with practiced precision, despite hands trembling from malnutrition. "Ma'am," the corpsman said quietly, "you should be in a hospital bed yourself." Durrett did not look up. "Corpsman, I have been working in worse conditions than this for 3 years. I can manage a few more hours. Hand me the plasma." Her tone was matter-of-fact, brooking no argument. By midday, American commanders decided to begin evacuating the sickest internees despite ongoing combat. Ambulances arrived under armed escort, loaded patients literally dying from starvation, departed for hospitals in Leyte. The nurses helped with triage, identifying who needed immediate evacuation and who could wait, the same life-or-death decisions they had made throughout captivity. A Navy doctor examined Davison, measured her weight at 80 pounds, noted advanced malnutrition with signs of organ failure, ordered her placed on the first transport. Davison refused. "I will not leave until all my nurses are accounted for and evacuation arrangements are complete. Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but I have responsibilities to these women and the patients in this camp. Those responsibilities do not end because American forces arrived." The Navy commander, who outranked Davison, stared at her with frustration and admiration. "Captain, you are dying, your kidneys are failing, your heart is stressed from prolonged malnutrition, you need immediate hospitalization, or you will die. That is medical fact. Commander, I have been dying for 6 months. I can die tomorrow as easily as today, but I will not abandon my post while my nurses require leadership." Davison's tone made clear the discussion was over. The commander shook his head, but did not argue. He had fought through the Pacific campaign, seen courage under fire, but he recognized something different in this skeletal woman who refused evacuation because duty demanded she stay. He made a note in her medical file and moved to the next patient. February 23, 1945. The Navy nurses, transferred to Los Baños internment camp in May 1943, were liberated in a parachute assault by the 11th Airborne Division. All 11 survived. For the first time in almost 3 years, all 77 American military nurses captured in the Philippines were together, alive and free. The press descended immediately. War correspondents wanted interviews with the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor, wanted photographs, wanted dramatic stories. The nurses, unused to attention after 3 years of anonymity, found themselves famous. Headlines ran across America. All 77 nurses survived Japanese captivity. Radio broadcasts described their ordeal. Politicians praised their courage. The public, hungry for good news, embraced them as symbols of American endurance. But the nurses were reluctant heroes. When reporters asked Lieutenant Alice Zwicker about her experiences, she said simply, "We were just doing our job. We're nurses. That's what nurses do." When pressed for details about starvation, she refused to elaborate. "I would rather not talk about it. We survived. That's all that matters." This became the standard response. They had survived something that killed millions: starvation, disease, imprisonment under brutal conditions, while maintaining professional duties and caring for thousands of other prisoners. But they did not see themselves as special. They saw themselves as women who had done what was necessary and who now wanted to go home and forget. The medical examinations at Leyte told a different story. Doctors documented the physical toll with clinical precision. Average weight loss, 30% of body weight. Many showed permanent organ damage from prolonged malnutrition. All suffered vitamin deficiency diseases. Teeth were loose or missing. Hair had thinned. Bones had become brittle. Lieutenant Frances Nash weighed 79 pounds when liberated, down from 125. She had edema so severe her legs had swollen to twice normal size. Her albumin levels indicated advanced liver dysfunction. She had lost 8 teeth. Doctors estimated she had been 2 weeks from complete organ failure when liberation came. Josephine Nesbitt, at 49 the oldest nurse, weighed 78 pounds, down from 145. She had suffered 3 bouts of malaria during captivity, chronic dysentery, beriberi, that caused her feet to swell so badly she could not wear shoes. Yet she had continued working, managing nursing schedules, organizing care, even when too weak to walk without assistance. The doctors wrote that it was medically remarkable any of these women survived. That all 77 survived was unprecedented. The standard mortality rate for Allied POWs held by Japan was 37%. Of 27,000 American military personnel captured by Japan, roughly 10,000 died in captivity. The nurses' survival rate of 100% defied statistical probability. Several factors explain this. First, the nurses remained together as a cohesive unit throughout captivity, supporting each other. Second, they maintained strict discipline and routine, giving themselves structure and purpose. Third, they shared all resources equally, preventing hoarding. Fourth, they continued practicing their profession, which gave them purpose beyond survival. But the most important factor was leadership. Maude Davison had kept them alive through force of will and intelligent management. She enforced discipline when discipline seemed pointless. She insisted on sharing when sharing meant receiving less. She maintained military standards when standards seemed absurd. And she gave them something to believe in, the promise that they would all walk out together, that not one nurse would be left behind, that survival was collective. March 1945. The nurses were evacuated to hospitals in the United States by hospital ship, a 3-week journey across the Pacific. During this voyage, they began processing what had happened. For 3 years they had focused on survival, on getting through one more day. Now, with survival assured, they faced the psychological aftermath. Lieutenant Eleanor Garron spent the voyage writing in a journal, documenting experiences, trying to make sense of what she had endured. She wrote about the hunger, the constant obsession with food, dreams about meals, how nurses would spend hours discussing recipes. She wrote about watching people die from starvation, seeing bodies consume themselves, knowing there was nothing she could do. She wrote about fear, constant low-level terror that the Japanese would execute them, that they would die from disease, that liberation would never come. But she also wrote about bonds formed between nurses, relationships deeper than normal friendship because they were forged in shared suffering. She wrote about Davison's leadership, how the captain kept them together through discipline and example. She wrote about Nesbitt's quiet strength, how the older nurse managed practical details and kept morale up. She wrote about small victories, finding an extra cup of rice, successfully treating a patient, making it through another day alive. Lieutenant Madeline Ullum did not write. She could not. Every time she tried to put experiences into words, she found herself unable to continue. The memories were too fresh, too painful, too overwhelming. Instead, she sat on deck staring at the ocean, trying to reconcile the woman she had been in 1941, young, optimistic, excited about adventure, with the woman she had become. The ship docked in San Francisco in late March 1945. The nurses were greeted as heroes, welcomed with parades and ceremonies. Politicians gave speeches praising their courage. Military brass awarded medals, bronze stars for valor, presidential unit citations, commendations from generals and admirals. The nurses stood in formation wearing new uniforms that fit poorly because they were still skeletal, and they accepted honors with quiet dignity while inwardly wondering what the fuss was about. They had done their jobs. Wasn't that what everyone did during war? But America in 1945 was not prepared to understand what these women had experienced. The public knew nurses had been captured, knew they had been prisoners 3 years, but they did not understand the reality of starvation or the psychological toll of prolonged trauma. The newspapers called them angels. The public saw them as symbols. But the nurses felt like frauds, like they had done nothing special, like the real heroes were the men who died on Bataan. And there was another problem. They were women. American society in 1945 had specific expectations for how women should behave, and those expectations did not include being combat veterans who had endured years of imprisonment. The nurses found themselves caught between contradictory narratives. On one hand, they were heroes who had served under extreme conditions. On the other hand, they were women who should now return to traditional roles, get married, have children, put the war behind them. The Veterans Administration was not prepared to help them. The VA in 1945 primarily served male veterans. Female veterans were an afterthought. The nurses found themselves denied benefits available to male POWs. They were not eligible for certain medical care. They could not join veterans organizations like the VFW or American Legion because these organizations did not accept women. They received less compensation than male veterans despite comparable trauma. Davison struggled with this. After liberation, she was promoted to major and awarded the Legion of Merit. But when she applied for medical retirement due to permanent damage from malnutrition, the War Department initially denied her request, arguing her disabilities were not service-connected. She fought for months, providing medical documentation and testimony, before finally receiving the retirement she deserved. She retired in 1946, moved to San Francisco, lived quietly until her death in 1956 from complications related to imprisonment. Nesbitt retired in 1945 at 51. She returned to private nursing in California, working in small hospitals and doing home care, rarely speaking about experiences. She lived to 98, dying in 1993. Even late in life, she maintained she had done nothing extraordinary. "We were nurses," she told an interviewer in 1990. "We took care of people. I don't understand why people think that's special." Many nurses married and started families, working hard to build normal lives. Some continued nursing careers. Others left nursing entirely, unable to reconcile wartime experiences with peacetime practice. Almost all struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in the 1940s and 1950s, there was no diagnosis, no treatment, no acknowledgement that psychological trauma from war could have lasting effects. They rarely talked about experiences, even with each other. The bonds formed in Santo Tomas remained strong. Many stayed in touch throughout their lives, attending reunions, writing letters, maintaining friendships forged in suffering. But they did not discuss details of captivity. They did not describe the hunger, the fear, the daily struggle. When children asked about the war, they gave brief answers and changed the subject. When historians requested interviews, many declined. April 9, 1980, Mount Samat, Bataan Province, Philippines. Male veterans who survived the Bataan Death March gathered at the Mount Samat National Shrine to dedicate a bronze plaque honoring the nurses. The plaque reads, "In honor of the valiant American military women who gave so much of themselves in the early days of World War II. They provided care and comfort to the gallant defenders of Bataan and Corregidor. They lived on a starvation diet, shared the bombing, strafing, sniping, sickness and disease while working endless hours of heartbreaking duty. These nurses always had a smile, a tender touch, and a kind word for their patients. They truly earned the name the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor." Several surviving nurses attended. They were in their 60s and 70s now, grey-haired and wrinkled, but still recognizable as the women who survived 3 years of hell. They stood together as they always had, a unit, and listened as the men they had cared for spoke about what the nurses had meant to them. One veteran described watching Lieutenant Rosemary Hogan work through an air raid, continuing to clean his wound while bombs fell nearby, never showing fear, though he could see her hands shaking. Another remembered Lieutenant Eunice Young, sitting beside his bed in Malinta Tunnel during bombardment, holding his hand and talking about his family to distract from explosions overhead. The nurses listened with tears in their eyes. When the plaque was unveiled, they stood silently looking at words engraved in bronze. Then, Hattie Brantley, now 67, said quietly, "We did our job. That's all. We just did our job." August 20th, 2001. The Pentagon, Arlington, Virginia. The Secretary of the Army presented the Distinguished Service Medal posthumously to Captain Maude Davison for her leadership during captivity. Davison had been recommended for this award in 1946, but the War Decorations Board rejected it, ruling her actions were performed under orders from male medical officers and therefore did not qualify as independent heroism. For 55 years this decision stood. Then, in the late 1990s, historians and veterans advocates reviewed cases of World War II veterans denied recognition due to gender or racial discrimination. Davison's case was reopened. Evidence was reviewed. Testimony from nurses who served under her, medical records from Santo Tomas, statements from male officers who witnessed her leadership. In 2001, the Army reversed the 1946 decision. Davison's niece accepted the medal. She gave a brief speech describing Maude Davison as a woman who believed in duty, discipline, and taking care of people who needed care. "She would not have wanted a fuss made," the niece said. "She would have said she was just doing her job. But we know it was more than that. She kept 76 other women alive through 3 years of starvation and imprisonment. Every one of them survived. That's not luck. That's leadership." By 2001, most Angels of Bataan had died. Old age, illnesses, complications from imprisonment, time catches everyone. But their legacy remained. They proved women could serve in combat zones. They demonstrated female prisoners of war could survive extreme conditions. They showed professional discipline and collective action could overcome individual suffering. The Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948, which granted women permanent status in the regular armed forces, was influenced directly by these nurses' service. Lawmakers cited the Angels of Bataan as evidence women deserved full military status. The expansion of nursing roles in subsequent wars, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, built on foundations laid by 77 women who survived when survival seemed impossible. Today, only memory remains. The last Angels of Bataan died in the early 2000s, but their story endures in books, documentaries, museums, memorials. Young nurses joining the military learn about Davison and Nesbitt and the women they led. Medical schools teach their story as an example of professionalism under extreme duress. The answer to how they survived lies not in individual heroism, but in collective endurance. The Angels of Bataan survived because they survived together, because they shared everything, because they maintained discipline, because they found meaning in caring for others, because they believed Maude Davison's promise that they would all walk out together, and they made that promise true through 3 years of starvation, disease, and imprisonment. 77 women entered Santo Tomas in July 1942. 77 women walked out in February 1945. Not one left behind. Not one died in captivity. In the entire history of World War II, in all prison camps operated by all combatant nations, no other group of prisoners achieved this record. They were just nurses doing their job. But sometimes doing your job, day after day, through impossible circumstances, is the truest form of heroism. Sometimes survival itself is victory, and sometimes the greatest courage is not dying for your country, but living for it, enduring whatever must be endured, maintaining humanity when everything tries to strip it away, and bringing everyone home. The Angels of Bataan did that, all 77 of them, together. 100% survival rate in a Japanese POW camp. In all of World War II, no other group achieved this. If stories like this make you think about what real leadership looks like, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And leave a comment. What would you have done in Davison's place?